I have spent my professional life learning how to distinguish signal from noise, and one of the oldest mistakes in intelligence is mistaking what is visible for what is decisive. When policymakers talk about Russia today, they talk almost exclusively about the war everyone can see: tanks destroyed in Ukraine, missile strikes, casualty estimates, and shifting front lines. This fixation has allowed Washington to congratulate itself on a story of Russian weakness while missing the more consequential reality unfolding beneath the surface. Intelligence is supposed to prevent that kind of blindness. Instead, it has enabled it. The war in Ukraine has been framed in Washington as a conventional military test that Russia is supposedly failing. That assessment rests heavily on selective battlefield indicators, many of them filtered through Ukrainian reporting, Western media amplification, and intelligence estimates shaped by policy expectations. I have seen this movie before. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, and earlier in Vietnam, intelligence analysis was bent to fit desired narratives rather than uncomfortable facts. The result was not just bad policy, but institutional self-deception on a massive scale. What rarely gets discussed honestly is that Russia never approached this conflict as a purely conventional war aimed at rapid territorial conquest. Russian doctrine, military reform since 2008, and force structured decisions all point to a strategy of attrition, escalation, control, and endurance. When intelligence analysts treat the absence of blitzkrieg success as proof of failure, they reveal more about Western assumptions than Russian intent. This is not analysis, it is projection. The strategic consequence of this misreading is profound. By overemphasizing visible tactical setbacks and underplaying Russian adaptation, U.S. policymakers convinced themselves they were managing escalation when, in fact, they were reacting to it. Intelligence warnings that contradicted optimistic assessments were marginalized, softened, or delayed. I know how this happens. Analysts learn quickly which conclusions are welcome and which stall careers. Over time, dissent disappears without anyone issuing explicit orders. The hard lesson here is simple and brutal. When intelligence stops interrogating assumptions and starts validating policy, it ceases to function as intelligence. The battlefield you can see becomes a comfort blanket, allowing leaders to ignore the wars they do not want to acknowledge. That failure set the stage for everything that followed, because once you misread the nature of the conflict, every subsequent decision compounds the original error. When Washington pivoted from the battlefield narrative to economic warfare, it did so with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. I watched senior officials speak as if sanctions were a precision weapon guaranteed to collapse Russia's economy, fracture its elite, and force a strategic retreat. Those claims were not grounded in sober intelligence analysis. They were rooted in a recycled theory of coercion that had already failed against Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. The assumption was simple and disastrously wrong: that economic pain automatically translates into political submission. From an intelligence perspective, the first distortion appeared in the baseline assessment. Analysts emphasized Russia's dependence on Western finance and technology while minimizing structural resilience that had been built deliberately after 2014. Moscow accumulated large foreign reserves, reduced sovereign debt exposure, localized key industries, and developed alternative trade and payment channels. None of this was secret. It was publicly documented. Yet intelligence products continued to frame Russia as economically brittle because that conclusion aligned with policy desires. The sanctions regime was then evaluated through short-term indicators that flattered Western expectations. Currency, volatility, inflation spikes, and corporate exits were treated as signs of imminent collapse. What went unexamined was adaptation. Russia imposed capital controls, redirected trade flows, increased energy exports to non-Western markets, and used state intervention to stabilize strategic sectors. Intelligence reporting acknowledged these moves but consistently downplayed their cumulative effect. That is a classic analytical failure, cataloging facts while refusing to revise conclusions. The strategic consequence was escalation without leverage. Sanctions became performative rather than coercive, signaling resolve to domestic audiences while hardening Russian threat perceptions. Instead of splitting elites, they consolidated them. Instead of isolating Moscow globally, they accelerated the erosion of dollar centrality and incentivized alternative financial arrangements. These were predictable second-order effects that intelligence should have flagged clearly and early. It did not, because doing so would have contradicted the political narrative that sanctions were decisive. What troubled me most was the internal logic used to defend failure. Each new sanctions package was justified by arguing that previous ones had not gone far enough. This is not analysis, it is faith-based escalation. Intelligence assessments became circular, measuring success by intent rather than outcome. When the predicted collapse failed to materialize, timelines were extended and definitions adjusted. The hard lesson is unavoidable. Economic warfare is not a substitute for strategy, and intelligence that serves as a cheerleader for coercion is worse than useless. It blinds policymakers to endurance, adaptation, and unintended consequences. Once that blindness sets in, credibility begins to erode not just abroad, but within the institutions tasked with telling uncomfortable truths. I have never believed that information warfare is about controlling facts. It is about shaping perception, narrowing debate, and disciplining doubt. What disturbed me during this conflict was not that Washington engaged in narrative management that is standard practice, but that intelligence institutions gradually mistook messaging for reality. When analysts begin consuming their own press releases, the line between assessment and propaganda collapses. From the earliest days of the war, the information environment was treated as a battle space where unity mattered more than accuracy. Intelligence briefings were calibrated for public release, leaks were curated, and inconvenient uncertainties were smoothed over. I watched assessments migrate from classified channels into talking points almost seamlessly. That migration should alarm anyone who understands intelligence, tradecraft. Real analysis is probabilistic, conditional, and often uncomfortable. What replaced it was declarative certainty designed for headlines. The distortion became self-reinforcing. Media outlets echoed official claims. Those echoes were cited as validation, and intelligence products then referenced the media environment as evidence of narrative dominance. This is a feedback loop, not verification. In past intelligence failures, from Iraq's weapons of mass destruction to Afghan security force readiness, the same pattern appeared. Confidence grew as independent validation declined. When dissenting analysts raised concerns, they were accused of undermining morale or aiding adversaries. I have heard those accusations before. They are the death rattle of analytical integrity. The strategic consequence was a dangerous overestimation of control. Policymakers assumed that shaping Western narratives equated to shaping global perceptions. Intelligence reporting underestimated how audiences outside the transatlantic bubble interpreted events through their own historical experiences of Western intervention, sanctions, and selective outrage. Russian messaging did not need to be persuasive, it only needed to highlight Western inconsistency. That asymmetry was consistently missed. Internally, the damage was deeper. Analysts learned to write toward pre-approved conclusions, language became sanitized, probabilities hardened into assertions, and alternative hypotheses were quietly dropped. Over time, institutions stopped asking whether the narrative matched reality and focused instead on whether it was coherent. Coherence is not truth, it is simply alignment. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals are supposed to internalize early in their careers. When intelligence becomes a tool of narrative enforcement, it loses its corrective function. It stops warning and starts reassuring. In an information war, the most dangerous illusion is believing you are winning because your own audience is applauding. That illusion left Washington unprepared for the strategic shifts already underway beyond its narrative perimeter. The idea of fighting Russia through a proxy was sold in Washington as a low-risk, high-reward strategy. I listened to briefings that framed it as a controlled experiment. Bleed Russian military power, avoid direct confrontation, and preserve escalation dominance. From an intelligence standpoint, That logic rested on a stack of assumptions that were never stress tested against reality. Proxy wars are not abstractions, they are dynamic systems shaped by adversary adaptation, domestic constraints, and escalation psychology. Those realities were consistently discounted. The first distortion lay in how Ukrainian capability was assessed. Intelligence reporting emphasized Ukrainian motivation and tactical ingenuity while glossing over structural dependencies. Ukraine's military effectiveness was inseparable from Western intelligence, logistics, targeting data, and sustainment. That dependence created a paradox policymakers refused to confront. The more effective the proxy became, the less deniable Western involvement was. Analysts flagged this risk quietly, but it was politically inconvenient. Escalation control was assumed, not analyzed. At the same time, Russian adaptation was persistently underestimated. Each new Western weapons system was treated as a potential turning point rather than one variable in an evolving conflict. When Russian forces adjusted tactics, dispersed assets, hardened infrastructure, or expanded industrial output, those moves were described as signs of strain rather than learning. That framing allowed policymakers to interpret resilience as weakness. Intelligence should have challenged that inversion. Too often, it reinforced it. The strategic consequence was a steady erosion of deterrence, clarity, red lines blurred, then disappeared. As Western involvement deepened, Russia adjusted its own thresholds without public fanfare. Intelligence assessments focused heavily on what Moscow said it would not do and far less on what it was structurally preparing to do. That imbalance is fatal in escalation analysis. Adversaries signal more through capability development than rhetoric, and those signals were treated as background noise. What made this failure systemic was institutional memory loss. The United States has a long history of proxy conflicts producing outcomes opposite to those intended, from Afghanistan in the 1,980 seconds to Syria decades later. Intelligence lessons from those cases were known, documented, and largely ignored. Instead, optimistic analogies were selected, while cautionary ones were dismissed as irrelevant. The hard lesson is not that proxy wars always fail, but that they demand ruthless analytical honesty. When intelligence is used to sustain a strategy rather than interrogate it, blind spots multiply. Escalation becomes something you hope to manage instead of something you actively understand. By the time that realization sets in, options narrow and credibility erodes further, both with adversaries and allies. One of the most revealing intelligence failures in this entire episode was how completely Washington misread the rest of the world. Policymakers behaved as if Western alignment was the default setting of the international system, and that deviation from it required explanation. Intelligence reporting too often reinforced that assumption instead of challenging it. The result was strategic surprise that should never have been a surprise at all. From an analytical standpoint, the warning signs were obvious. Large portions of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East did not frame the war in Ukraine through the same moral or historical lens as Washington. Many of these states remembered Western interventions justified by selective intelligence, humanitarian rhetoric, or rules-based claims that were later abandoned. Intelligence assessments acknowledged these grievances in passing, but treated them as secondary to presumed economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. That was a fundamental misjudgment of agency. The distortion appeared clearly in sanctions analysis. Intelligence products assumed that economic self-interest would compel compliance. What they underestimated was strategic autonomy. Countries weighed the costs of alignment against long-term sovereignty, energy security, and freedom of maneuver. When they chose neutrality or quiet cooperation with Russia, Washington interpreted it as hedging or fear rather than a deliberate strategic choice. That interpretation was comforting but wrong. The strategic consequence was the collapse of the narrative of isolation. Russia did not need universal support. It needed sufficient external engagement to blunt Western leverage. Intelligence underestimated how quickly alternative trade routes, financial arrangements, and diplomatic forums would absorb that shift. Instead of recognizing the emergence of a looser, interest-driven multipolar order, assessments clung to an outdated block model rooted in Cold War memory rather than present reality. Internally, this misreading fed policy rigidity. When countries refused to fall in line, intelligence explanations gravitated toward misinformation, coercion, or corruption, rarely toward legitimate divergence. That reflex mirrored earlier failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, where local agency was consistently minimized. Intelligence that cannot accept disagreement as rational behavior is intelligence that cannot predict outcomes. The hard lesson here is stark. Global credibility is not enforced. It is accumulated. Once intelligence institutions internalize the belief that alignment equals legitimacy, they lose the ability to understand why influence decays. The Global South did not break ranks suddenly. It simply stopped pretending that Western narratives were universally binding. That shift exposed how narrow and self-referential American strategic thinking had become. By the time the strategic consequences became impossible to ignore, the deeper problem was no longer external. It was internal. Intelligence institutions had become captured not by foreign adversaries, but by their own incentive structures. I have seen this transformation from the inside, and it does not require conspiracy or bad faith. It requires only a slow alignment of career advancement with narrative conformity. The distortion begins subtly. Analysts learn which judgments are rewarded and which are tolerated. Over time, language shifts. Estimates become more confident where uncertainty would be honest. Caveats are buried. Alternative hypotheses are framed as low probability without rigorous testing. None of this is ordered. It emerges organically in systems where senior leadership is closely integrated with policymakers and where intelligence is valued more for reassurance than warning. What was once an adversarial relationship between intelligence and policy became a symbiotic one. Policymakers wanted validation, intelligence leaders wanted relevance. The result was analysis shaped to remain inside acceptable boundaries. I watched assessments that should have triggered fundamental policy reassessment instead be framed as manageable challenges. That framing preserved access and influence at the cost of truth. The strategic consequence was institutional inertia. When intelligence agencies become invested in the success of a narrative, acknowledging failure threatens credibility, budgets, and leadership reputations. This creates a powerful bias toward continuity. New data is interpreted through old assumptions. Signals that contradict the dominant frame are labeled anomalies. Over time, the organization loses its capacity for self-correction. This is not unprecedented. Similar dynamics preceded the intelligence failures surrounding Iraq's weapons programs and Afghan government stability. In both cases, dissent existed but was marginalized. Postmortems identified politicization, groupthink, and career pressure as key drivers. Those lessons were documented, then quietly ignored. Institutional memory proved shorter than institutional pride. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Intelligence agencies cannot serve power and truth simultaneously without constant internal tension. When that tension disappears, it is a warning sign, not a success. An intelligence system that never surprises policymakers is one that has already failed its core mission. By the time reality intrudes, trust has eroded and options have narrowed to damage control. The final war, the one Washington least understands, is not being fought with missiles, sanctions, or narratives alone. It is a war over credibility, competence, and belief in American judgment. This war is largely invisible to policymakers because it does not announce itself with dramatic events. It reveals itself in quiet recalculations by allies, cautious distancing by partners, and a growing reluctance to accept U.S. intelligence assessments at face value. From an intelligence perspective, this is the most damaging outcome of all. Credibility is the foundation on which warning, deterrence, and influence rest. Once it erodes, even accurate intelligence is discounted. I have spoken with foreign officials who now treat U.S. assessments as advocacy documents rather than analytical products. That shift did not occur because of Russian persuasion. It occurred because Washington repeatedly used intelligence to justify predetermined policies then ask the world to ignore the results. The distortion here is self-reinforcing. Faced with skepticism, intelligence institutions double down on narrative coherence rather than analytical humility. Confidence is mistaken for authority. Dissenting external views are dismissed as disinformation or bad faith. This defensive posture further accelerates credibility loss. Intelligence that cannot acknowledge error cannot rebuild trust. The strategic consequence is isolation by overreach. Allies hedge, partners diversify, adversaries exploit predictability. None of this requires dramatic confrontation. It unfolds through trade agreements, energy deals, defense procurement choices, and diplomatic forums that quietly exclude U.S. leadership. Intelligence reporting often captures these developments descriptively, but fails to connect them to the deeper cause: erosion of confidence in American strategic judgment. What makes this war invisible is that it lacks a clear endpoint. There is no treaty to sign, no territory to reclaim, no victory declaration. There is only gradual decline or deliberate reform. The latter requires an intelligence culture willing to confront its own failures honestly. That means restoring analytical independence, protecting dissent, and accepting that power does not guarantee correctness. The hard lesson is the one intelligence professionals are trained to deliver, but institutions struggle to accept. When intelligence becomes fiction, strategy becomes delusion. The collapse of the American strategic narrative was not inevitable. It was chosen incrementally every time comfort was prioritized over clarity. Reversing that collapse will not come from louder messaging or harsher sanctions. It will come, if it comes at all, from the painful restoration of truth as a governing principle rather than a rhetorical device.